to get started, may I ask you to introduce yourself and
yes,
with a quick overview.
A physician by training, way back more than 40 years ago, and I've spent my first 10 years of my life in academia in cancer research and did my doctorate there, and then I started working in a large American pharmaceutical company, also doing cancer drug development there for 10 years, 12 years actually, and then I moved back from the US and England to Denmark and worked for a Danish pharmaceutical company and was first leader of their development and then subsequently for their R&D organization up until 5 years ago, where I retired from there, and now I've done for the last 10 years while I was at Lundbeck, but also subsequently board work, so I'm still extensively involved in pharmaceutical drug development in different companies and settings, mostly smaller companies, but also some quite large ones.
Innovation doesn't just happen in-house, it happens as a network of collaborators across cultures, across geographies, which compounds the challenge. How do you decide what to bring in-house versus what you can just work with outside the organization?
There's always a tension between things the things you might want to bring in-house, but you may not be able to because some people are happy and good where they are. So you always need to think about what is the environment that they're in, and what can you offer as a additive, or what makes it better to have it in-house than having it where it is. And certainly there is something in the sort of the actual work that's being done as such. How do they work best? Who do they work with? How do they get the things achieved? But also you need carefully to think through how do you, I wouldn't say protect the system that you're working with, because in some ways everybody needs to have a common interest in what is it that you want to get to. So it does take some both discussions with people, but also a great deal of trust, and I think that puts you could say some pressure on individuals, because if they are not being trusted, if they do things that seem strange, then they may lose out in this open environment, because that is not something that you don't control people the way you easily did before, but you rely on them, and that's a different thing. And then obviously there is some legal elements sometimes when you get into the patent stuff and all this kind of rights and who does what, but publications, and that's always a tedious story. But you can find your way through that.
So having a good understanding of that can let you leverage and align interests in a sense, even though those interests may be different. Yeah,
and you often have to take these discussions of one-on-one offline without everybody else and figure out what is it really that you want.
Right.
We're doing this thing, it's great, we can all benefit from this from our vantage points, and then but what is particularly interesting for you in this respect?
And you've done a lot of work in R&D, as you were saying, bringing new drugs to market, and there is in innovation that paradigm of saying part of a company will be exploring, trying to bring those novelties, and the other one is maybe part of exploiting, meaning running operations, having to run the machine, etc. And at least in the literature and the principles of it, there's a bit of a contradiction between the two. Because in one hand you try to optimize and have things process that are very smooth and stable, while on the other side you try to bring something new and break the old habits in a sense. I was wondering whether you experience those tensions, and if so, how do you deal with it?
Very much so. But that hopefully, when you are in a more operative function, often you should experience it less. But if you the more significant your position is strategically within the company, obviously you will get confronted with a lot of that tension, and you basically have to rely on your ability to argue your position and also understanding the other's angle into it. I mean, you will never get away with being just persistent on your own angle into a particular problem. I mean, you can sometimes want to perfect something to an extent that you lose the thing. So you have to figure out what is the right moment, what is the sufficient time, sufficient thing you have done here to move forward. And other times you get pushed back on things where you have to trust your own sentiment with the people from your background and say, we think this has enough innovation in it that even if it may not get exactly what we expected, we think there is something worthwhile to pursue with it. And that is often a long discussion you have with colleagues from different disciplines within the organization. So that's where also the mutual trust between different groups in the company has a significant role to play.
And when you look at groundbreaking innovations, then how can you incubate them within the company, or is it better left to universities or places outside of the company that have a longer maybe time horizon?
I think actually it's almost opposite. I think there's certain parts of research that is very, very experimental. You could say almost you don't even have a clue as to where is it heading. That can be kept for years outside in an academic environment, right. And that's where some of this early innovation has to take place outside. But the minute you get a sense of where you want to try to apply this, then the horizon, the spectrum that you get to work with it is often much longer. There's much more of a strategic focus. You decide to invest in something, and then you do it for a much longer period than a 2 or 3 year grant that you will get at the university. So there's not a need to cut things into pieces to publish something, to get a new paper written, to get new funding. So some of the cycles you have in academia are actually quite short compared to what they are when you are working in the industry, where you often have a much more overall discussion about this is where we think things are going, and then you put your money where your thoughts are basically, and you pursue it as long as you still feel that this is the right thing to do. And sometimes you lose money. That's why people always question, why do you need to make such a huge profit? Because it costs a ton of money and you make so many mistakes as you go along. And that's, you have to be able to carry that, to have that horizon to do the work there.
That leads me to another question, which is, do you see the basis for competition in the industry having shifted?
Yes, I think in terms of the internal capabilities, yes. I mean, if you take with technologies that allows you to do what we often call transitional research between, you could say, the more technical discovery work on cells or animals and then into humans, and read back some of the data you get in humans and do that in a very expedited manner and deal with unexpected findings. That part of research has become much more critical and competitive, you could say, to do that. And also to appreciate sometimes there are things you cannot do well yourself, because you may not be the best one to do exactly that for a therapeutic area that you're not competent in. There may be others that do that, and therefore you can sometimes figure out that, well, this may not work for us here, but there may be others who can do better work here, and then you split out the program to others to work in that particular field, because that part is what they can do. So I'd say that part of research has become much more, or development, you could say, of medicines has become much more critical than it used to be.
It sounds like a lodestar for you in your leadership is presence.
Mm-hmm.
Being
Yes.
there, being
You have
present.
to be, yes.
In order to build both trust but also courage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I think you have to be very conscientious of what your own limitations are in terms of knowledge, and also appreciate where somebody has some particular insights, and say, well, they may not have a usual role here, but they have a particular insight that may be advantageous to bring forward here, and so have that being brought to the table and discussed. And I think sometimes you're not the one, you're rarely the one that knows most about everything that's going on. You are mostly the one who knows least about every piece of it, but you just have to make sure that the whole puzzle gets put together to an extent that everybody are, being sensible people, which they mostly are, get to a common understanding of where it is. So you could say, you create an environment where the decision is being made. When people say you bring it into a board for a decision, I usually tell them, when we discuss it, either before or afterwards, say, what came out of that meeting, was that a surprise to you, or was that what you really thought would have happened anyway? And hopefully they say the latter, because it should be so that the board is facilitating the forum for that reflection to have happened, so that it is pretty evident that this is where you're heading. It doesn't mean you have to pre-negotiate all kinds of stuff necessarily, but there has to have had enough discussion to mature the thinking around this.
Yeah. Another thing you mentioned before was, you said quite firmly, you make so many mistakes.
Yes.
Working in such a complicated area that we're talking about, how do you deal with a challenge like that on a more personal level? Making a mistake, or knowing you are just in front of a mistake, how does it influence you? You are under pressure. You have to be pretty resilient to live with it ultimately, because there are situations where you have spent billions of kroner on something, and you could say you could say a mistake in the sense that things didn't succeed. Perhaps it's not that a rational person wouldn't have perhaps have chosen the same thing, but they could also have chosen to do a different thing, but you have to live with the consequence that you have just spent a lot of money and a lot of time, and things didn't materialize the way you wanted. And ultimately, if you are the leader of that structure, it's your responsibility that has happened. And what we have spent a lot of time doing in many of the organizations I've worked with is that we basically, instead of being too awfully sorry and sad about that, we spent time actually figuring out, what did we learn from this? What are the things that we picked up here? Where could we have found things? And what were the steps where we were misled by whatever we saw? That's a very cognitive approach, a very kind of clever approach to say, don't cry, learn from it. You're highlighting, of course, how important it is to have good colleagues, but you're also highlighting the importance of having a relevant network, a trusting network. But it takes a lot of time to build network. How do you build a relevant network? What should you be aware of?
I think you have to, be fairly straightforward with yourself, and basically be trusting towards people, and I think
not have a preconceived notion that somebody may not be able to know or bring value to you because they are not substance experts. But they may have a human insight, human experience that you can talk with them about, and they will often reflect on that. And I think it just takes time to be with people.
It takes time.
Yeah.
Respecting the fact that it takes time.
Yeah.
But also being aware of how important it is.
Yeah.
If you should give a good advice for a young person who would like to dive into being a leader, what would be your clever advice?
I think to stay focused on doing the job, so to speak, not being focused on themselves. I mean, there are many young leaders who want to achieve something, they want to become something instead of wanting to do something. And I think that is the most important thing to keep focusing on, that if you may want to have a particular role because you want to do something, not just because you want to have that role, because that role may be just an empty shelf if you don't have a reason to pick it. And I think to stay focused on making a difference in what you're doing is important as one thing, and secondly to respect that you are just one piece of the puzzle. I mean, the others are as important as you are yourself. If you're a leader, you may be asked to lead somebody for whatever reason, but the others may be just as competent or more competent than you are for a lot of the stuff that's going on, but you may still be the better leader. And that's a different thing. That it doesn't mean that you are better or anything like that, but there's often hierarchy that comes into many people who want to become leaders, and I think that's the most dangerous thing in wanting it more than wanting it for making an impact.
Anders, what are you most proud of in your professional life?
I think first and foremost to have been to a larger or lesser degree instrumental in bringing a lot of good medicines out to patients that would not have been there, or may not have been there if I had not been there. Or they may have been in different shapes and formats, I don't know, but I've at least had sometimes a strong role, sometimes a lesser role, but I've been deeply engaged in doing that, and I think that is something I'm very happy with. And then I think from an organizational perspective, there have been two different sceneries where basically we're confronted with the area that I've had an interest in would either survive as an organization or not survive as an organization, and I have been very engaged and committed in making it survive as such, either as an independent company or as a part of a big company, and it's both parts are still alive and thriving today, so I'm happy that I'm
You are a doctor in your deepest bone and blood, saving life of a company, saving life of many more people, because you could multiply your knowledge.
Berit, so what have you noticed in this conversation, this dialogue with Anders?
When I was carefully listening, I took some notes, and I think one impression became very clear to me. It is Anders' attraction to complexity. He's very inspired when things are complex and there's no quick answer. Even when it comes to leading people, he highlighted how inspiring it is to lead differences in culture, differences in opinions, differences in approaches. So having this attraction to dealing with complexity and then boiling it down to things that become clearer and clearer to make clever decisions. That was the impression I got. Bigger picture, boiling down. Bigger picture, boiling down. I guess it is the key when you work with research. You have to have this kind of ability to be very, very open-minded and dare to be in the not knowing position and then figure out how to reach the optimal decision, and having the courage knowing that, like Anders said, there will be a lot of mistakes. Can't be avoided. If you can't dare make mistakes, you cannot be in a job like this.
So cutting through that complexity and understanding how to innovate with whom, etc., knowing your strengths. So it feels that there's a lot of discipline in the thinking.
Yes, exactly. That exactly, discipline, a lot of self-discipline, and following the necessary next step, knowing that it is extremely complicated, but he likes complexity. It's inspiring and motivating, and he doesn't want to live without it. And then the courage, the knowledge, knowing that mistakes will be made, and daring to stay in that year after year. Another thing that came across clearly was Anders' respect towards humans, respectful and value-driven towards dealing with relational issues, dealing with individuals, being fair. That was a strong impression he gave. And I think it's connected to his statement that courage and trust, being able and dare to take the tough discussions and have the trust where it's possible. Probably he is a role model creating that because of his respect towards other humans. People must be able to kind of get that sense. And by sending that signal, he is putting the kind of the platform for trust and courage. You asked me if how I perceived his way. I wrote a sentence here. Very, very rational approach to challenges. That's exactly what you mentioned, this ability to stay in the rational, analytical thinking. And when it becomes emotional and personal, deal with it and figure out what is the solution, knowing that it is a personal challenge, but then what should we learn from it? That's also a very rational approach. When there is a mistake, don't cry, learn.